We're now going to talk about 4 important words in ecology and compare them, because often these words get confused by people. The first few words we've seen already, and they are environment, habitat, as well as ecosystem. But there's a new word as well, which is niche, and that's the first concept that we'll look at here. So the niche is the role that an organism plays in its ecosystem. The role an organism plays as it's living its life. And the animal that we'll look at here is the echidna, to talk about what its niche is as it's living. So firstly, the niche involves talking about where that species lives, when, how, and what. And the types of things that we're talking about with the niche are: where does the animal live, where it lives, which is its habitat, when, this is things like when is it awake, is it nocturnal, or is it awake during the daytime, and when does it breed as well, because many species only breed at certain times of the year. The how questions we can ask are: how does it interact with other species? Is it a predator or is it a prey? Or does it compete with other species for certain foods and things like that? We can also ask what it eats. So all of these things combined together tells us a story about how that echidna lives, which is its niche. And in an ecosystem, every different species has its own niche. Even if two species seem to be similar, has its own niche. Even if species seem to be similar, there will be slight differences in their niche. So maybe they live in a different area slightly, or maybe they're awake in the nighttime compared to the day. There'll be small differences. So now let's look at the 4 different terms that we're going to compare. We have environment, habitat, ecosystem, and niche. If we look at environment and habitat, these 2 terms are just looking at the physical area. They're just looking at what is in an area. Whereas ecosystem and niche are looking at what's there, but also the interactions between species. So, in other words, they're thinking of a system. If we look also at these 2 terms, the environment and the ecosystem, they're talking about many species in a larger area, whereas the habitat and the niche are only talking about a single species. So a good way to compare the differences between all these 4 words is in a two-way table. So we'll draw up a two-way table here. So in this column, we have the terms talking about the physical space, and the others are talking about the system as a whole. And then in this row here, these terms are talking about many species, whereas this row is just for a single species. And now we can see that the word that means the physical space with many species, this is the environment. So for example, with an echidna, it lives in a woodland environment. And a woodland has tall trees, it has shrubs, grasses, herbivores, insects. We know what's in that type of environment. Then if we look across, when we start thinking of the environment as a system, we now call that an ecosystem. And for the echidna, it lives in a woodland ecosystem. So it still includes the same things as a woodland, but when we're thinking of an ecosystem, we're now thinking about how do those things interact. What species are the predators, which species are the prey, how much rainfall, and what are the temperatures throughout the year. That's part of the ecosystem. Now if we're just looking at the physical space of one species, that's the habitat. And for the echidna, in its woodland environment, it lives on the ground, under trees. So the habitat is the specific place where one species lives. And finally, if we're talking about how does that one species interact in its ecosystem, that's the niche. So for the echidna, its niche is where it lives in its habitat. So it lives on the ground, and also what it eats, which are insects, and that it has spines for protection from predators, as well as the environment that it lives in, which is a woodland. So these four terms, environment, habitat, ecosystem, and niche, even though they seem similar, they actually have important differences when we're talking about ecology.